This is the second example in our series about t-tests. Before we did a one sample t-test where we were comparing a sample mean to the population mean or trying to estimate the population mean using the sample mean. Now, however, we're going to have two samples where we compare the mean of one sample directly to the mean of another. Okay, so let's take a look at this. You'll want to go ahead and open Notebook 15, which is called Two Sample T-Tests. I do want to make the point that um, that we'll refer to them as two sample t-tests, but they're also called independent samples t-test. And I want to make a point because the word independent starts with IND, and that's actually how we're going to identify the uh, the code that we use to run these two sample t-tests. So go ahead and get your Notebook 15 open. And I just opened the notebook and I ran the initial cell. And so again, we're looking at the baby.csv file, which is about births. Okay, and so the key thing that we're looking at here is we have a sample of some moms who were smokers and some moms who were not. And based on that, we can do different analyses of, how much the babies weighed at birth, the number of gestational days of the pregnancy, and so forth. So what we're going to focus on is we're going to select these two columns, maternal smoker and birth weight. Why? Well, because healthier babies, this is an older data set, and so a rough proxy for health of the baby was birth weight. And while babies can be too heavy, we know that now, they can also be too light. And preemies and, babies who are underweight at birth might be considered less healthy or at more risk. Okay, so this birth weight is just being used as a proxy. Again, it's a rough proxy for the health of the child. So what are we going to do? We're going to compare whether the maternal smoking status, true or false, has anything to do with birth weight. All right, so let's take a look here. Right, our null hypothesis is that the two groups have equal averages. All right. And so in group one, we'll use that to indicate the non-smoking mothers, and group two will be the smoking mothers. And the alternative hypothesis is, hey, there's some difference in the average birth weights between the two groups. Okay, and again, we're using birth weight as a proxy of the health of the baby, and perhaps smoking during the pregnancy might have an impact on the eventual baby that's born. All right. Um, and let me jump back up here. Okay, so what do we do? Well, the first thing we do is you can see that we get a count to see, and there are 450 of the babies that were born to smoking moms and 715 that were born to non-smoking moms. And I want to mention that this is an older data set. I think the percentages might be lower these days now that more data is out there about the health of the baby during the pregnancy. But this is an older data set. And then what are we doing? We're getting group stats, which is much like Fave stats, but it works for a category variable. All right, and what do we do? Um, well, we name the table, and then we give the grouping variable, and then we give the numeric variable name. All right, and the table doesn't need to be in quotes. The two variables do. And we see, oh, look, the average birth weight for the non-smoking moms was about 123 ounces compared to a number that's almost 10 ounces less, okay? And these are fairly large standard deviations, so we know there's a lot of variability in these birth weights. What we don't know is whether or not there's any impact, okay, based on smoking. Okay, so one of the first things they do as we're preparing the data is that we create these side-by-side box plots. And you can see there are some outliers there on the left, but notice that the smokers on the right, that box plot looks to have a mean that is significantly different. Now, I'm saying significantly different, and I said looks to be, right? This is just an association. We don't have the scientific evidence until we run this two-sample t-test. Okay, why did I mention the part about this being called independent samples? Because that's how we identify this. So when I'm running a two-sample t-test, I want to use the t-test underscore IND. That means that the two samples are independent. That means that if you're in one sample, you can't be in the other. So for example, we could use North Georgia freshmen versus North Georgia seniors. And it's pretty clear that one person couldn't be in both samples. You either have, fewer than 30 completed college credit hours and qualify as a freshman, or you have more than 90 college credit hours and qualify as a senior. And you can't have both less than 30 and more than 90. So those samples would be independent. Okay, same thing. If the mom is a smoker, she can't simultaneously be a non-smoker. In this case, one would have to be one or the other. Okay, so the t-test underscore IND is the correct thing. Notice that the equal var equals false. Let me just say that that's an option we're always going to use, equal var equals false. And when we run it, notice that the test statistic is about 8.626, and the p-value is 2.656 times 10 to the negative 17th. So please notice that the p-value is very, very, very close to zero. Okay, and so we can see the results are here, right? The p-value is small, it's less than 0.05, and therefore we reject the null. We conclude there is a significant difference in birth weights for babies based on whether or not their mothers were smokers or non-smokers. So from the box plots, we can tell that the non-smoker mothers had babies with the higher birth weights. Okay, so now we have evidence that smoking may be harmful. We have scientific evidence that smoking may be harmful to the fetus during pregnancy. Okay. And reporting out is going to look very similar to what we've seen in the past. We do have evidence for a difference in average birth weights between these two groups. And the greater average is in the non-smoker group. The greater average birth weight is in the non-smoker group. And the difference is statistically significant. And P is actually far less than 0.001. Okay, so we have a very significant result. We have very strong evidence that the average birth weights are different. Okay, so the next thing we're looking at is, wait, I'm sorry. This is still the birth weights by mother smoking status. All right, and it does go through the hypotheses, and we've already seen these on the slide, right? We are testing first to see if the two groups have an equal mean. We can test to see if if the means are different, which is a two-tailed test, or we can do one of the one-tailed tests where the hypothesis has the greater than or the less than. Okay, and you can go through these. Are you going to have to know the t-test formula? No, but this is how it's calculated, assuming unequal variances, which is why we do that population var or equal variance. It's equal underscore var equals false. Why? Because we're assuming unequal variances. Don't worry about that. That's a little bit of stats theory there. And then the degrees of freedom are similar to the one sample case as the degrees of freedom get higher, the t-distribution gets closer and closer and closer to the bell curve. All right, and we can see based on degrees of freedom how the t-distribution is changing. Now, we're going to talk about the p-value a little bit later. And so we're just going in here to look at how we would interpret the p-value. But remember that the birth weight average, we already found this, at least from the box plots, that there is a difference in the birth weights. Okay. And I was planning to do another example, but I'm not going to do that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on what we need to do to run this. Okay, so the first thing to notice is that group 1 and group 2, they both have to be in array data. So we have to do some work up here to get from the table the two groups of values into array form, right? So we definitely need two arrays, one for group 1, one for group 2. In this case, smoking moms and non-smoking moms, all right? Now, I told you that this equal var equals false. We're just always going to use that. Again, I'm not going to go into statistical theory right this second. And please remember that the stats.ttest_ind, that's the one we're going to use for the two sample t-test. Why? Because one of the assumptions in the test is that the two samples are independent, that a research subject could not simultaneously be in both, can just be in one or the other. Okay, and gestational days, the number of days the pregnancy lasts. If we did do that, we would end up with a test statistic around 8.6 and a p-value of 2.656 times 10 to the negative 17th. And we would have p less than alpha, so we would reject the null. Okay? So the key things to remember are how to use this particular function, the t-test_ind, and the big thing to remember is that we need array data for both groups to go in. So we're going to have to use a dot column to pull that array data down out of the table.